The morning Edna Maddox buried her husband, the sky over Cimarron, New Mexico territory, was the color of a bruised purple and swollen at the horizon, pale and exhausted where it met the dust. And she held her two children's hands so tightly that her knuckles went white as bone, and she did not cry, not even once. She was 32 years old, and she had not cried in front of her children in the 7 years since her daughter Clara was born, and she was not about to start now. Not here in the red dirt beside a pine box that held what was left of Robert Maddox, who had ridden out 3 weeks ago to chase down a stray heifer, and had come back slung over his horse with a rattlesnake bite gone black up his leg to the knee. She had done everything she knew how to do. She had cut it, drawn the poison, burned the wound, prayed every night on both knees until the floor planks pressed bruises into her skin. It had not been enough. It was the year 1878, and Cimarron sat on the edge of what people back east still called the frontier, though the people who lived there called it home, and home had a way of demanding everything from a person and sometimes taking even more than that. Edna's daughter Clara was 7, with black hair and her father's serious brown eyes, and her son Thomas was 9, with a gap in his front teeth and a habit of chewing on the collar of his shirt when he was frightened. He was chewing on it now. Edna watched him from the corner of her eye, and she thought, "Hold on, hold together. You are the only thing standing between these two children and the whole hard world." And so she squared her jaw and she stood straight while the preacher spoke his words over the red New Mexico dirt. And when it was done, she walked her children back to the wagon and she drove the horse home herself. The Maddox Ranch was 112 acres along the Cimarron River. It had a 2-room house with a good stone fireplace, a barn that needed new roofing in one corner, a small chicken yard, and a kitchen garden that Edna had coaxed out of the alkaline soil with coffee grounds and whatever rotted kitchen scraps she could spare. It had been a modest operation, even with Robert alive and working it. Without him, in the brutal arithmetic of the territory, it was barely survivable. She had 12 head of cattle, 2 horses, and $37 in a tin box under the kitchen floorboard. She had until the 1st of October to pay the land note at Beaumont's bank in town, and October was 4 months away. She told none of this to Clara or Thomas. She served them supper salt pork and cornbread and the last of the dried apples, and she read to them from the Bible the way Robert had always done, because she thought the routine might be something to hold on to, and she tucked them into their shared bed in the back room, and she kissed their foreheads, and she closed the door quietly. Then she sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time with her hands folded flat on the wood surface, breathing evenly, the way a person breathes when they are working very hard at something. She did not cry. In the weeks that followed, Edna Maddox became a woman people in Cimarron watched with a mixture of admiration and something that looked uncomfortably like guilt, because watching a woman hold a ranch together alone while her husband was barely cold in the ground had a way of making people feel they ought to be helping more than they were. The widow Perkins down the road brought a pie the first week. The Garza family, whose spread sat a mile east along the river, sent their eldest son Miguel to help her mend the corral fence one Saturday, and she thanked him with dinner and sent him home before dark. The men at the feed store in town were polite to her. But polite did not keep a ranch running. She learned things Robert had never taught her, because he had meant to teach her and had run out of time. She learned which calves needed separating, and how to read the sky for the dry lightning that could roll in fast off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and light the grass on fire. She learned that a fence post set in dry ground would pull loose in a week if you did not tamp it right, and she learned the tamping the hard way, on her knees in the July heat with a wooden maul that blistered both her palms. Clara helped where she could. Thomas, who had gone very quiet since his father died, had taken to rising before Edna in the mornings and feeding the horses without being asked, and there were moments when she watched him do it. This 9-year-old boy in his father's 2 big boots, and felt something move through her chest like a wave that she had to push back down before it became something she could not stop. She did not let it become something she could not stop. It was on a Wednesday in late July, 6 weeks after the funeral, that she first laid eyes on Emmett Kendrick. She had driven the wagon into Cimarron for supplies, and she had Thomas with her because he had developed a cough in the night that she wanted Dr. Haverson to look at, and she had just come out of the general store with a sack of flour over her shoulder when she heard a commotion from the direction of Beaumont's bank, which sat on the opposite side of the main street. Two men were having what appeared to be a heated disagreement on the bank's front steps, and one of them, a wide, red-faced man in a good suit who she recognized as Arthur Beaumont himself, was jabbing his finger at the other man's chest the way he did when he was telling someone something they did not want to hear. The other man was taller than Beaumont by half a head. He wore trail-worn clothes, a tan duster coat that had seen considerable weather, and boots that were good quality but cracked along the seams from long use. He had his hat in his hand. He'd taken it off. She would notice later, not in submission but in that careful way some men do when they want to be clear they are keeping their temper on purpose. And his hair was dark and cut short, and even from across the street she could see the set of his jaw, which was the jaw of a man who had just been told something unfair and was deciding what to do about it. She paused with the flour sack on her shoulder, not intending to stare but staring a little. She heard Beaumont say, quite clearly in the still morning air, "The price on that parcel is what it is, Kendrick, and if you don't like it you can ride back to wherever you came from." The tall man Kendrick put his hat back on slowly, and he said something she couldn't hear, and then he turned and came down the steps in a couple of easy strides, and he was already halfway across the street before he noticed her standing there, and he stopped, and for a moment they were simply looking at each other across the dusty main street of Cimarron in the July heat. He had gray eyes. She hadn't expected gray eyes. The face around them was weathered and lean, not unpleasant to look at, with a long diagonal scar along the left jaw that looked old enough to have faded from white to silver. She put his age somewhere around 35, maybe 36. He looked like a man who had spent most of his life outdoors and had made peace with that fact. He tipped his hat. She nodded back and shifted the flour sack and went to load it in the wagon. She thought nothing more about it, because she had a sick child beside her and $37 in a tin box and 4 months until October. Thomas's cough turned out to be nothing alarming. A bit of dust in the lungs, Dr. Haverson said, common enough in July. Give the boy plenty of water and keep him out of the barn for a week. She drove home through the late afternoon with Thomas dozing on the wagon seat beside her and the flour in the back, and a new problem knocking around in her head. 2 of her steers had gone lame in their rear legs from something Haverson couldn't identify, and if she lost them both, that was $40 walking out the gate right there. She had put aside the matter of the tall man with the gray eyes entirely by the time she got home. It was 3 days later that he appeared at her fence. She was in the kitchen garden, on her hands and knees pulling the bindweed that got into the bean rows faster than she could keep up with it, and Clara was sitting on the fence rail pretending to keep her company but mostly watching a lizard that had taken up residence near the gatepost. Thomas was in the barn, keeping himself usefully out of trouble, or so she hoped. The afternoon sun was angling low and mean through the dust, and Edna had a bandana tied around her hair and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she was in no way prepared for company. She heard the horse first, a steady walk coming up the track from the road, and she straightened and shaded her eyes, and there was the man from the street, Emmett Kendrick, coming along her fence line on a bay horse, leading a second horse, a roan, by a lead rope. She got to her feet and brushed the dirt from her knees and waited. He pulled up at the gate and took his hat off, and she thought, there it is again, that deliberate gesture like he's making a point of being respectful. "Mrs. Maddox," he said. "My name is Emmett Kendrick. I was told by Miguel Garza that you might be in need of some help." She looked at him for a moment. "Miguel Garza talks too much," she said, which was true. A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "He said you lost your husband recent and that you're running this place alone." "That is also true," she said. "What of it?" He seemed to think about how to answer that. "I'm looking for work," he said. "I've got experience with cattle. I've been driving north and south along the trail system since I was 18. Worked 3 seasons for the Goodnight operation out of Texas. Spent 2 years running a small outfit of my own in Colorado before it went under in the bad winter of '76. I'm not looking for charity, and I'm not offering any. I'd work for fair wages, or for a share of whatever you bring in at autumn sale if wages aren't possible." She studied him. He sat the horse easily, not slumping, not puffing himself up either, just sitting the way a man sits when he's comfortable in the saddle. She looked at the roan he was leading. It was a good horse, well-fed, clean-limbed, and that told her something about a man, how he kept his animals. "Why here?" she said. "Beaumont's got cattle operations he'd hire onto. The Maxwell land grant people are always looking for hands." He was quiet for a moment. "I've worked for outfit men," he said. "Big operations, men who bought up land by the acre and ran it like a factory. I'm not looking for that kind of work anymore." He paused. "A small ranch is a different thing. It means more to the people on it." She didn't know what to do with that exactly. She looked at Clara, who had abandoned the lizard and was now staring openly at the man on the horse with the undisguised curiosity of a 7-year-old who has decided someone is interesting. "What are you offering exactly?" Edna said. "I can mend fence, work cattle, help at roundup. I know a fair amount about what ails livestock. If those steers you've got limping in the far field are any indication. I noticed them on my way in. Looks to me like it might be a foot problem, could be foot rot, could be something simpler. I'd need to get close to tell. I can read weather well enough to keep hay out of the rain. I can repair most things on a working ranch with what's available." He looked at her straight. "I won't be a burden, Mrs. Maddox. I'll earn what you give me." She thought about the lame steers. She thought about October. She thought about the fence post she'd set wrong twice now that still pulled loose every time the wind came hard from the north. "There's a bunk in the barn," she said. "It's not much. I've slept in worse. I pay in shares, not in coin, not until I know what the autumn brings. That's fair. My children live in this house," she said, and she let the sentence sit there between them with all its meaning arranged around it, the warning and the boundary and the thing she was trusting him to understand. He met her eyes and did not look away. "Understood," he said. "Completely." She opened the gate for him. Clara immediately jumped down from the fence rail and walked right up to his horse and put her small hand on its nose, and the bay lowered its head to her obligingly. And the man on the horse watched this with an expression that was so carefully neutral it almost looked like he was working not to smile. Thomas appeared from the barn doorway with a pitchfork in his hand, squared his thin shoulders, and assessed the newcomer with the gravity of a 9-year-old who has recently become the only man on the property. Emmett looked at him with equal seriousness and said, "You must be Thomas." He did not say it in the way adults say things to children to make children feel included. He said it the way you'd introduce yourself to someone whose opinion mattered. Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then said, "You can put your horses in the 3rd stall. There's clean hay." "Much obliged," Emmett said. Edna watched this exchange and felt something shift slightly in the region of her chest, something that she catalogued carefully and set aside, because she had a ranch to run, and she could not afford to be moved by things right now. He was right about the steers. It was foot rot, caught before it had gone too deep, and he treated it with what he had in his saddlebag, copper sulfate and clean bandaging. And within a week both animals were sound enough to move freely. She watched him work with the cattle, and she saw immediately that he knew what he was doing. That easy authority with livestock that comes from years of practice. The way he moved among them without crowding, the way they didn't spook when he came close. He had the same quality with horses. She noticed that Clara had decided he was one of her favorite people within about 48 hours, a judgment Clara generally reached slowly, and this she catalogued as well, though she tried to tell herself it didn't mean anything. He fixed the fence post the third day he was there. He set it with water tamped into the dirt by stages, letting each layer settle, and it stood the next north wind and the one after that, and she stood by the fence afterward looking at it and thought, that is a man who knows how to do things correctly. He was not a man who talked excessively. She appreciated that. He spoke when he had something to say, he asked direct questions when he needed to know something, and the rest of the time he was simply present doing the work. He ate supper with them, because she had said it was part of the arrangement, and because cooking separately in the barn was impractical, and the meals were quiet in the way that a table is quiet when the people around it are comfortable with each other, not the heavy silence of strangers. Clara talked enough for everyone anyway. She told Emmett about the lizard she was planning to catch and name, about the dream she'd had involving a purple horse, and about the fact that she believed she could learn to whistle if someone showed her how. Emmett taught her to whistle the following evening on the porch after supper, with a patience that appeared to be entirely genuine, while Edna sat in the rocker and shelled beans and tried not to pay too much attention to the sound of her daughter laughing. She was not ready to notice things like that. She was very clear with herself on this point. The trouble with being very clear with yourself on a point is that the clearer you are, the more energy you are spending on being clear about it, which rather suggests you need to spend that energy in the first place. On a Saturday evening in August, Emmett came in from fixing the north pasture gate and washed up at the pump and came to supper with a deep cut along the back of his right forearm where a piece of wire had caught him, and she made him sit and let her clean and bind it. And when she was winding the bandage around his arm, her hands were very steady and careful, and he sat very still, looking somewhere over her left shoulder. And the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the children playing in the back room, and she was so aware of the warmth of his arm under her hands that she finished the bandage faster than she needed to and tied it off and stepped back and said, "That should hold," and went to stir the pot on the stove with more attention than the pot required. That night she lay awake for a long time. She was not ready. She was increasingly aware, not entirely in control of when a person is ready and when a person is not. August passed into September in the dry heat of the territory, and the work of the ranch gathered itself into the dense busyness of late-season preparation. Emmett had transformed the barn roof, replacing the rotted corner planks with wood he'd bargained for at the mill in town in exchange for a day's labor, and the barn held its new tightness with pride against the first cool nights. He had ridden out to assess the cattle twice a week all through August and had come back each time with precise, practical reports on the state of the herd, and when she asked his opinion on which animals to bring to autumn sale, he gave it directly, with reasons, and she found his reasoning sound and adopted it. He had also, in the evenings when the light was good, been teaching Thomas to rope. This had not been requested or planned. It had begun when Thomas had found one of Emmett's ropes hanging in the barn and had been trying, unsuccessfully and with great seriousness, to practice a loop, and Emmett had simply stopped and said, "Here, your wrist is doing too much work," and had shown him the motion, and Thomas had looked up at him afterward with an expression that Edna, watching from the doorway, had to look away from because it was too large and too fragile and too much like what a boy looks like when he needs a man and doesn't have one anymore. She went back to the kitchen and made a lot of noise with the dishes so no one would wonder why she'd gone quiet. On a Tuesday in the second week of September, she drove into Cimarron to the bank. She had the proceeds from the sale of 2 horses she'd made the difficult decision to part with, and the money from a neighbor who'd bought 8 jars of her put-up preserves, and she had done the arithmetic carefully enough to know that she was going to be $60 short of the land note payment if the autumn cattle sale did not go well, and she needed to talk to Beaumont about an extension. Arthur Beaumont was the kind of man who has always had money, and therefore has never understood what it costs to not have any. He was not cruel exactly, but he was also not kind, and he looked at her across his wide desk with the expression of a man who has made up his mind before the conversation began. He told her that the terms of the note were the terms of the note, and that if she could not meet the payment by the 1st of October, he would have to consider his options as a lender. He told her she might want to consider whether a woman alone, and here he paused just long enough for the words to settle with their full weight, could really manage a cattle operation in the current market. She thanked him politely and left. She sat in the wagon on the main street for a moment with both hands on the reins and the horse standing patient in the heat, and she breathed slowly and evenly, and she drove home. She told Emmett that evening after the children were in bed. She hadn't planned to. She had planned to handle it herself, the way she handled everything, but he was sitting on the porch steps when she came out for air, and he looked up and said, "What happened in town?" And something about the directness of it, not intrusive, just present, undid whatever she'd arranged in herself on the drive home. She told him about the note. She told him about Beaumont's manor. She told him the number, $60, which felt enormous and shameful in a way she couldn't entirely explain. He listened without interrupting, which was something she had come to understand was characteristic of him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark pasture where the cattle moved as soft shapes in the moonlight. "How many head you plan to bring to the Cimarron sale?" he said. "6 steers," she said. "7 if the young one reaches weight." "At current prices you'll be close," he said. "If we bring them in good condition." He turned to look at her. "I know a buyer out of Santa Fe, a man named Lawrence, who pays above the general sale price for quality animals. I can send him a wire from town and he might come up and look. He's bought from me before and he's straight dealing." She looked at him. "You'd do that?" "I'd send a wire," he said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "He does what he does, but it's worth trying." She nodded. She looked away again, out at the dark pasture. The night insects had started up, the small, persistent sound of them that she had always found either comforting or unbearable depending on what kind of night it was. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "This ranch is worth keeping." And there was something in the way he said it, "this ranch, not your ranch," as though he had begun to think of it as a place he was part of that she noticed and stored away and lay awake with later. Emmett sent the wire the next morning and got a reply by Friday. Lorenzo Medina, the buyer from Santa Fe, would come to Cimarron the Wednesday before the general sale to look at her animals. He was a compact, dark-eyed man who arrived on horseback with 2 hands and walked her pasture with a quiet thoroughness, looking at each animal with the focus of someone who has been doing this for 30 years, and could read a steer the way a scholar reads a page. He offered her a price per head that was, in fact, $18 more per animal than the general sale average. She did her arithmetic on the spot and did not let the relief show in her face, but she accepted, and they shook hands on it. When Medina's men drove the cattle south the following Thursday, Edna stood at the fence and watched them go and did her final accounting in her head and found that she had, with what she'd already set aside, enough for the bank note and $40 left over. $40, not wealth, not safety exactly, but not disaster either, not losing the land. She turned from the fence and found Emmett standing a few feet behind her, not watching her, looking at the departing cattle with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something careful and contained. "We made it," she said. He looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted, not a dramatic shift, not a man who shows everything, but something moved behind his eyes and settled differently than before. "You made it," he said. "I just sent a wire." "You did considerably more than that," she said. He looked as if he might say something and then did not say it, and instead looked away again toward the mountains, and she was aware of the distance between them, 5 feet of New Mexico air, as a thing with its own particular quality, charged and particular, and she turned and went back to the house. She paid the bank note on the 1st of October. She sat across the desk from Arthur Beaumont, and she placed the money on the wood surface, counted and bundled, and she watched him take it and write his receipt without particular pleasure on either side, and she folded the receipt and put it in her coat pocket and stood up. "I'll be making the same payment next October," she said, "and every October after that." Beaumont looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, as if he was deciding how surprised to be. "I expect you will." She walked out into the sharp October morning with her hands in her pockets and the receipt folded against her palm, and she did not let herself feel how extraordinary this ordinary errand was. She got in the wagon and she drove home. October brought cool air from the mountains and the particular sweetness of the cottonwood trees turning along the river, yellow enough to seem to glow in the late afternoon light. The work shifted to the slower rhythm of autumn, putting up feed, checking and rechecking the barn's readiness for cold weather, laying in supplies before the mountain passes became uncertain. Emmett was there for all of it, steady and capable and present in the particular way that a person can be present where it starts to feel not like an arrangement, but like a fact of the landscape. She became, in that October, increasingly aware of him as a man, which was an awareness she found inconvenient and chose to deal with by staying busy, which was not difficult. There was always something to be busy with. She noticed the sound of his boots on the porch boards in the morning. She noticed that he always poured her coffee first, without making a ceremony of it. She noticed, one evening when she was reading to Clara and Thomas and hadn't known he was at the door, that he had been standing in the doorway of the sitting room listening to her read with an expression of such quiet plainness, not romantic, not tender in any performed way, just openly present, just listening, that when she looked up and saw him, he straightened and excused himself and went out, and she put her face back in the book and kept reading without a break. But her heart was doing something irregular. She did not address this. She was very good at not addressing things. In the third week of October, Thomas fell from the corral fence while he was practicing a dismount and twisted his ankle badly enough that Dr. Haverson needed to come out and wrap it, and he was confined to the house for 4 days, which was a form of torture for a 9-year-old boy who had decided that the ranch was his domain and he was needed in it. Emmett spent both evenings of the first 2 days sitting with Thomas at the kitchen table, teaching him to play cards, not gambling, just the mechanics of the games. And when Clara demanded to be included, she was included. And the kitchen table had a different quality in those evenings than it had had in years, possibly ever. And Edna sat in her chair by the fire and mended Thomas's shirt, and tried to be fair-minded about what she was witnessing. It was on the 4th day of Thomas's confinement that she came downstairs at night, late, unable to sleep, and found Emmett sitting at the kitchen table alone in the low light of the lamp with a letter in his hand. He was not reading it. He was just holding it the way a person holds something they've already read many times and have learned the whole weight of. She stopped in the doorway and he looked up, and for a moment they were both still. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not disturbing anything," he said. He folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. She should have gone back to bed. Instead, she poured herself a cup of water from the pitcher and said, "News from home." He was quiet for a moment. "From Colorado," he said. "From a lawyer. The small ranch I told you about, the one that went under in '76. I had a partner. He passed in August. I didn't know until this week." Came and sat across from him. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at the folded letter. "We ran that place for 2 years," he said. "It was good land. The winter of '76 came hard. You wouldn't remember it in New Mexico maybe, but in Colorado it was the worst winter in 20 years. We lost half the herd in January. We couldn't recover from it financially. He went back east after that. I went south." He paused. His name was Caleb Ward. He was 31 years old. She did not say anything. Sometimes a person doesn't need anything said. They just need someone to remain in the room with them while they carry something. She had learned this in the months since Robert's death, learned which visitors had helped and which had made her feel more alone by the sheer volume of their condolences. She stayed. After a time he said, "You've built something here, Mrs. Maddox. A real thing, 2 good children, a working ranch. You did that mostly alone since spring. I had help, she said, more recently. Before the recent help, he said. She looked down at her hands. I didn't know if I could do it, she said, which was more honest than she generally let herself be with anyone. I still don't know most days. I just do the next thing and then the next one. That's how it works, he said. That's the only way it works. The lamplight moved on the table between them and the house was quiet around them, the children sleeping, the night pressing close outside the windows, and she was aware of something large and unhurried happening in the space between them, something that had been building all autumn in the small accumulated moments, and she was not ready for it, and she was also not able to pretend she was unaware of it. She stood up. "Good night, Mr. Kendrick," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Maddox," he said. He did not press. He did not make it anything other than what she named it. She went back upstairs and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man with gray eyes sitting alone with a letter in the kitchen of a house that wasn't his. And she breathed slowly, evenly, the way she breathed when she was working at something difficult. November came in cold off the mountains, and with it came a new problem, as November in the territory generally provided. A man named Clyde Roper, who ran cattle on the parcel to the north of Edna's land, began to push his herd's grazing boundaries south, which was a tactic as old as the territory itself. A deliberate pressure on a neighbor he judged unlikely to push back. Twice she found his cattle in her north pasture, eating the winter grass she'd saved for her own herd. She had ridden out herself the first time and turned the animals back, and she had sent Thomas the second time with a message for Roper that she would appreciate him keeping his fence maintained. Roper sent back a message, delivered by one of his hands, that the fence line in question was disputed and she ought to come and discuss the matter with him personally, a suggestion that she found both unhelpful and vaguely threatening in its tone. She told Emmett about Roper at supper that evening. He listened, and then he said, "Do you have the original survey on file, the land record?" "Yes," she said, "at the county office." "Then the line isn't disputed," he said. "A man who says a surveyed line is disputed when it isn't is a man who's counting on the person across from him not knowing that." "I know that," she said. "I know you know that," he said. "I'm suggesting we go to the county office and get a copy of the survey and post it." He paused. "If it would help, I'll ride with you when you speak to Roper." "I don't need you to fight my battles," she said, not sharply, just clearly. "I know," he said just as clearly. "I'll just be there." She looked at him across the table, and the children were eating quietly, and she thought about the way he'd said that, "I'll just be there," with no performance attached to it, no pride or ownership, just a statement of simple presence. "All right," she said. They rode to the county office in Cimarron together the next morning and got the survey copy and rode north to Roper's place, and Edna did the talking. She showed Roper the survey document, and she told him, in very measured terms, where the fence line was and what she expected of him regarding it. And Emmett stood beside her horse with his hat on and his hands at his sides and said nothing. And his being there and saying nothing was its own kind of statement. And Roper, who was the kind of man who had spent his life taking the measure of other men and acting accordingly, looked from Edna to Emmett and then back to the survey document and said he'd see to the fence. The cattle stopped appearing in her north pasture after that. On the ride back she said, "You didn't need to come." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." There was a difference. She was learning. Between things Emmett Kendrick did because they were necessary and things he did because he wanted to. And the second category told her more about him than the first. The cold of November deepened, and the ranch settled into its winter routines, and Edna found herself in the strange, uncomfortable condition of knowing what she felt but being unable to do anything about it because she couldn't see clearly enough to know what the right next thing was. She had been a widow for 5 months. She had 2 children. She had a hired man who was the best thing that had come to her ranch since she couldn't remember when, and she was afraid of the thing she felt because she had felt something like it only once before. At 24 years old, when Robert Maddox had come into her father's hardware store in Cimarron and bought a box of nails and had come back the next day, ostensibly for more nails, and she had laughed and said the nails cost 2 cents each, and at this rate he was going to spend himself into the ground. And he had said he was prepared to spend whatever it cost, and she had fallen in love with him the way a young woman falls in love, absolutely and without reservation. And then she had lost him to a rattlesnake in a field in March, and she had stood beside a pine box in the red dirt and held her children's hands and not cried, and the world had become a place where love was something you spent, and then it was spent. She was not 24 anymore. She was 32, and she had 2 children, and she was not sure the world still worked the way she thought it had worked when she was young and had not yet lost anyone. She turned all of this over in her mind on the cold November evenings when the children were in bed and she sat by the fire, and she did not resolve it, because some things cannot be resolved by sitting by a fire thinking about them. And she went to bed and rose in the morning and made breakfast and went about the work of the ranch, which was the thing she knew how to do. It was on a Thursday in late November in the 3rd week of the month that everything arrived at once. It began with Clara, who had seemed fine at breakfast but by mid-morning was feverish and crying, and by afternoon had a temperature high enough that Edna sent Thomas to ride for Dr. Haverson at a gallop, and sat on the edge of Clara's bed with a cool cloth and her daughter's burning hand in both of her own, talking to her softly, telling her it was all right. Everything was all right, in a voice so steady, and even that no one listening could have known the fear underneath it. Haverson came and confirmed a serious respiratory infection, the kind that moved fast in children and could be dangerous. He left medicine and instructions and said he'd come back in the morning and that the next 24 hours would determine how serious it was. He drove away in the dusk and Edna shut the door behind him and stood in the front room for a moment in the dark, her hands at her sides. Thomas was at the kitchen table, very white-faced and chewing his collar again. Emmett was putting the horses up for the night. She went to Thomas and said, "She is going to be all right. Dr. Haverson knows what to do and we know what to do, and we're going to take good care of her tonight." Thomas nodded, 2 sharp nods, fighting hard against whatever was behind his eyes. She squeezed his shoulder and went back to Clara's room. She was there all night. Emmett slept across the threshold in the hall, which she hadn't asked him to do, but when she came out at 2 in the morning for fresh water, he was there with his back against the wall and his head on his chest, and his eyes opened the moment she moved, and she said, "Her fever broke a little," and he said, "Good," and she went to get the water. At dawn the fever dropped further, and by mid-morning when Haverson returned, Clara was asking for something to eat, which he called an excellent sign, and she had the slightly sheepish look of someone who has caused a great deal of trouble and knows it, and is trying to recover dignity through appetite. Haverson patted her head and said she'd be right as rain in a week and drove away again, and Edna walked him to the road and watched him go, and then she stood in the yard alone for a moment in the cold morning light. She had not eaten since breakfast the previous day. She had not slept. She had been the presence in the room that Clara needed, the steady voice and the cool cloth and the hand to hold, and she had done all of this without a tremor, because her children needed her not to tremble, and she had succeeded, and Clara was going to be all right, and the ground was dry and red beneath her feet and the cottonwoods along the river were bare now, and the mountains beyond were white-capped, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that the territory did in November, so clear it almost hurt. Emmett came from the barn. He had taken Thomas out to do the morning chores with him. She understood. To give the boy something useful to do during the long, anxious morning of waiting for the doctor's verdict. And now Thomas was still in the barn with the horses and Emmett came across the yard toward her, and he read her face from 20 feet away with the accuracy of a man who has been paying careful attention for months. He stopped in front of her and looked at her and did not say anything. And Edna Maddox, who had not cried in front of her children in 7 years, who had stood at a graveside and kept her face still and smooth, who had read the ranch's accounts in the dark alone and sat with the numbers until she made them come out right, who had faced Arthur Beaumont's dismissal and Clyde Roper's encroachment, and the long grinding solitude of doing everything alone, Edna Maddox cried. It was not a dramatic event, nothing convulsive or loud. It was simply that her eyes filled and spilled over, and her face did the thing she had kept it from doing for so long that she'd almost forgotten the feeling of it. And she stood in the November yard with her hands at her sides and cried because Clara was going to be all right and she'd been so frightened, and because she was so tired, and because the relief of it was almost too large to hold. Emmett reached into his coat and produced a clean, folded cloth, the kind a man carries in his inside pocket, and he held it out to her. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. She took the cloth. She pressed it to her face. She stood there and she cried, and he stood near her, not touching her, just present in the same particular way he had been present since July, the way that asked nothing of her and offered everything. And she cried until she was finished, which was not as long as she might have thought, because the relief had somewhere to go now, and it went there and came out the other side. When she lowered the cloth, she was not embarrassed. She was not sure why she wasn't, except that there was nothing in his face that would make a person feel embarrassed. There was just attention and steadiness and a kind of care so plain and unadorned that it had no performance in it at all. "Thank you," she said. "Clara is going to be fine," he said. "She was asking Thomas to show her the lizard through the window when I came out." She laughed, which surprised her, a short, genuine sound, and she pressed the cloth to her mouth. "She's impossible," she said. "She's remarkable," he said. "She's yours, of course she is." She looked at him then, the way you look at someone when you have stopped pretending not to know something and have decided to simply know it. He looked back at her with those gray eyes, and the morning was cold and clear around them, and the mountains were white and clean against the blue, and she thought, "This is a man. This is a man who knew what I needed before I did, and he handed me a cloth and he stayed." She handed the cloth back to him. He folded it and put it back in his pocket. They stood there for a moment in the yard. "Mr. Kendrick," she said. "Yes, Mrs. Maddox. When I was riding to Roper's place last month, I was thinking about what I would say to him. And you rode beside me the whole way, and you didn't offer advice or talk about anything. And it occurred to me at the time that it was exactly the right thing to do." She paused. "I think you might be a person who knows a great deal about what the right thing to do is." He was quiet for a moment. "I've done plenty of the wrong thing," he said. "I just try to pay attention." "To me," she said, and it came out not as a question, not as an accusation, just as an observation put plainly into the November air. He didn't look away. "Yes," he said, "especially to you." She nodded once, slowly. The cold pressed around them, and the horses made sounds in the barn, and somewhere Thomas was talking to the animals in the low, serious voice he used when he thought no one was listening. "I'm going to go check on Clara," she said. "I'll start on the feed," he said. She went inside. She sat on the edge of Clara's bed and watched her daughter eat a biscuit with considerable determination and complained cheerfully about having to stay in bed another minute. And Edna smoothed her hair back and said, "One more day." And Clara said, "That is an extremely long time." And Edna laughed again, the same real laughter as before, and Clara looked pleased with herself for causing it. December arrived, and with it the understanding, shared silently and then named carefully and then spoken plainly, that something between Edna and Emmett had shifted into a new country. It did not move fast. Neither of them was built for speed in matters of this kind, and they were both practical people with practical concerns, and there were two children who mattered enormously, and who were the most important consideration in everything. The first acknowledgment was this. On a December evening after supper, when Thomas and Clara were both in bed and the fire was burning low, Emmett was helping her with the account book, which she had asked him to look over because two of the numbers in her column didn't resolve, and he found the error, a transposed digit, easily missed, and said, "There it is." And she leaned over the table to see where he was pointing, and her face was very close to his, and he turned to show her, and they were suddenly much closer than the errand required. And she did not move back. And he did not move back. And they stayed there for a moment with the lamplight between them and the quiet house around them. "Edna," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name. "Emmett," she said, which was the first time she had used his. He said, "I want to say something and I want to say it correctly." She said, "All right." He said, "I came to this ranch looking for work and I found it and it's good work and I'm glad of it. But somewhere between July and November I stopped thinking of it as work I was doing for wages and started thinking of it as something I was part of. And I know that is not something I have any right to, because this is your land and your family, and you didn't ask me to feel that way." He paused, and she could see that he was being very careful, choosing each word with the deliberateness he brought to everything. "But I find that I care very much about what happens to you and your children. And I find that I care very much about you, specifically, in a way that is more than a hired hand and his employer, and I think you know that. And I don't want to be the man who lets a thing go unsaid because he was too cautious to say it." She looked at him for a long time. The fire shifted. The cold pressed against the windows from outside. "I know it," she said. "I've known it for some time." She took a breath. "I care about you too, in the same way. More than I was ready for, if I'm honest." "You don't have to be ready for anything," he said. "I know," she said. "But I want to be honest with you about where I am. I lost Robert 8 months ago. I have 2 children who have already lost one person. I will not move quickly with something like this, not because I'm uncertain, but because the stakes are large." "I understand that completely," he said. "I'm not asking you to move quickly. I'm asking you if I can court you properly. By which I mean, I would like to come to your door some evenings and knock like a man who is calling on a woman, rather than a hired hand who lives in the barn and eats at your table by arrangement." She almost smiled at that. "The arrangement hasn't been terrible," she said. "No," he said, "but I'd like to be clearer about what I'm hoping for." She was quiet for a moment. "You should know," she said, "that if you court me and if this becomes what it might become, then you are not just courting me. You are making a decision about Thomas and Clara as well." "I know that," he said. "I think I made that decision some time ago. Thomas is learning to rope and Clara can whistle 2 different tunes, and I have an opinion about what each of them needs and what each of them is capable of. And none of that is the opinion of a hired hand." He looked at her. "I mean that respectfully. I'm not trying to be something I'm not. I just know how I already feel about those 2 children." She thought about Thomas's face in the evenings when Emmett was teaching him something, the way the shadow of the last 8 months would lift for an hour, and he would look simply like a boy of 9 who was learning something from a man he trusted. She thought about Clara's complete and total certainty, from about the 5th day of Emmett's arrival, that he was a good person and therefore her friend. "You can court me," she said, "properly, by which I also mean slowly." He nodded, and the smallest shift of something in his face was the closest she'd seen him come to relief. "Slowly," he agreed. He had the good sense and the self-possession not to make anything dramatic of it after that. He finished correcting the account book. She made tea. They talked for a while about the spring plans for the ranch, which were practical and necessary to discuss, and then she said good night, and he said good night, and he went to the barn. And she stood in the kitchen for a moment with the teacup in her hand and the warmth of the fire and something large and careful, and new spreading through her chest like the first light of a morning that is going to be a good day. She did not stop it. She let it go where it went. He came to the front door the following Saturday evening with his hat in his hand and a small bundle of dried wildflowers he had found somewhere. She didn't ask where. She thought he might have carried them in from the fields, October dried and winter pale, which was the only kind of flower a New Mexico November offered, and he said, "Good evening, Mrs. Maddox," with a formality so careful it was almost grave, and she pressed her lips together to hold a smile and said, "Good evening, Mr. Kendrick," and invited him in. Thomas looked at the flowers and then at his mother and then at Emmett, and his expression ran through several calculations in quick succession. He was a 9-year-old of considerable intelligence, and he arrived at the correct conclusion. He said, "Did you bring those for my mother? in a tone that was attempting to be neutral and was not fully succeeding. Emmett looked at Thomas directly and said, "Yes, I did. I mean to call on her properly if she's willing, and I wanted to speak to you about it as well, because you're the man of this household and that matters." Thomas was very still for a moment. He was a child being spoken to as something adjacent to an adult, on a matter that was genuinely consequential to him, by a man whose opinion he had come to value in the preceding months, and the weight of all of that was visible on his face. Clara, who had been listening from the doorway with unashamed curiosity, said, "What does call on her properly mean?" And Thomas said, "Quiet, Clara," which was evidence he'd understood. "I want to be clear," Emmett said to Thomas. "No one is replacing your father. That is not what this is. Your father is your father, and he will always be your father, and that is not changed by anything. What this is me telling you that I care about your family and I'd like to spend time with your mother in a way that is open and respectful, and I'm asking you what you think about that." Thomas was quiet for quite a long time. Edna watched him and did not intervene because this was his conversation to have. "You fixed the fence," Thomas said finally. "Yes," Emmett said. "And you showed me how the post needs to be set so it stays." "Yes." "And you knew about the steers and the foot rot." "Yes." "Okay," Thomas said. He picked up his rope from the floor by the door and went back to the kitchen, which was, for Thomas, a conclusive statement. Clara, who had no patience for this level of procedural formality, said, "I already knew you liked each other," and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Edna and Emmett stood in the small front room with the dried flowers between them, and they both were, for a moment, entirely undone by this, which expressed itself as simultaneous, barely contained laughter and a warmth that filled the room. Christmas came to the Maddox ranch with a generosity that the previous months had not suggested was possible. Edna had made gifts: a new shirt for Thomas, a doll made from corn husk and calico for Clara, a pair of warm socks for Emmett that she'd knit in the evenings after the children were in bed, because she'd noticed his were wearing through at the heels. He had brought in a small pine from the hillside and set it in a can of sand in the corner of the front room, and Clara had covered it with scraps of ribbon and 2 small cut tin ornaments she'd made herself, and it was modest and lopsided and absolutely correct for what it was. Emmett gave Thomas a leather-handled pocket knife with his initials on it, the kind of gift that required enormous precision of judgment. Thomas was 9. It was the right age, and he was the right kind of careful boy to have one, and Thomas received it with the complete absence of speech that indicated he was more moved than he could currently express. He gave Clara a small carved wooden horse, which he'd made himself in the evenings in the barn, and it was a good likeness, standing with its head down and one rear leg cocked in the way a resting horse stands, and Clara held it and said, "It looks like Butterscotch," which was the bay horse she decided was hers, and Emmett said, "I had that in mind," and Clara placed the horse very carefully on the windowsill where the light was best. For Edna he had a small book of pressed botanical illustrations from the New Mexico territory, the kind sold at the bookshop in Cimarron for $2, which she suspected was more than he ought to have spent given what she was paying him. But when she opened it and looked at the careful engravings of native plants, the chamisa, the yucca, the desert rose, she said, "This is wonderful," and she meant it completely, and he said, "I thought you might like to know what's growing in your own ground." And there was the same quality in it that everything he said had, that directness that was also somehow kind. They ate Christmas dinner around the big table, all 4 of them, and the food was good. She had killed a chicken she'd been fattening for 2 months and made a pie from dried peaches and the good flour, and the conversation moved around the table the way it moves when a table contains people who are easy with each other. Thomas told a long story about the corral gate that involved considerably more drama than the event probably warranted. Clara explained at length her theory about why the bay horse preferred the 3rd stall to the 2nd, which was more observant than most adults' theories would have been. Emmett told a story about a Christmas he'd spent on a cattle drive in Texas in 1871, that had Thomas laughing so hard he nearly fell off his chair. Edna sat at the head of the table and she listened, and she looked around at the 4 people at this table, which was her table in her house on her land, and she felt the grief of Robert's absence, which was real and always would be, and she also felt something else that was equally real and present and alive, and she understood that both of these things could exist at the same time, and that this was not a betrayal of anything. This was simply how life continued, with everything it was made of inside it, the losses and the new things together. In January, she told Emmett that she would like him to stop paying rent on the barn bunk. She said this in the kitchen over the account book in a matter-of-fact tone, and he looked at her and said, "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," she said, "that I would like you to consider the ranch your home if that is what you want it to be, not as an arrangement, not as employment." She paused. "I'm not asking you to make a decision today. I'm saying that when you are ready to make one, the answer could be yes if you want it to be yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Edna, yes. I've been ready since September," he said. "I was waiting for you to be ready." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the January light, which was thin and clear and fell across the table between them, and she thought, this is what it feels like when you stop waiting and let a thing be what it is. "Then let's not wait any longer," she said. He asked her properly in February, on a Sunday afternoon, with Thomas and Clara both present, because he had talked to Thomas beforehand, which she learned later, not from Thomas himself but from Clara, who couldn't keep a secret for more than 48 hours, and he had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band that he'd carried in his saddlebag for the 3 years since his mother had died in Abilene, and left it to him with instructions to give it to someone worth giving it to. He went down on one knee on the front room rug, which made Clara clap both hands over her mouth, and he looked up at Edna and said, "Will you marry me? Will you let me be here, for you and for Thomas and for Clara for good?" She looked at him for a long time, the way she looked at things she wanted to see clearly. He stayed on one knee and he did not rush her, which was exactly like him, which was exactly one of the reasons the answer was what it was. "Yes," she said. "I will." Clara made a sound that was essentially a small explosion of joy and launched herself at both of them simultaneously. Thomas, standing in the doorway, looked at Emmett for a long moment and then walked over and held out his hand. And Emmett, still on one knee, took it and shook it man to man. And Thomas said, "Good," with all the gravity of someone 10 times his age, and then went to the kitchen and cut himself a piece of cornbread, because he had handled an emotional situation and now needed something to do with his hands. They were married in March, in the small church in Cimarron, with the preacher who had spoken at Robert's graveside, and who was enough of a decent man to see this for what it was, and say the words without reservation. Edna wore the dress she'd been saving the good blue wool for, cut in the style she'd seen in the catalog from the tailor in Santa Fe, which she'd spent 3 evenings making and 2 more altering, and it was exactly right. Emmett wore a new coat, the first new piece of clothing he'd bought in several years, dark and well-fitted, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle, and his face was the face of a man who could not believe his luck and was not ashamed of showing it. Miguel Garza sat in the 3rd row and accepted significant credit from his own conscience for having sent Emmett to the Maddox ranch in July, though no one had asked him to do so. The widow Perkins cried. Thomas sat very straight and solemn. Clara wore her best dress and had allowed Edna to put her hair up for the occasion and spent most of the ceremony alternately glowing with ceremonial importance and trying to see around the large hat of the woman in front of her. After the ceremony, there was a meal at the Garza house. Mrs. Garza had insisted with food enough for 40 people, because that was how Mrs. Garza expressed both generosity and satisfaction. And there was music from a fiddle and a guitar, and the afternoon passed in the particular warmth of a gathered community that is genuinely glad for something. Walking to the wagon in the late afternoon to drive home, Emmett took her hand, and she felt the ring on her finger, which was still new enough to notice, and she looked down at their joined hands and then at him, and she thought, here is a life. Here is a whole life starting from this point, built on everything that came before it. They drove home along the river under the March sky, with Thomas and Clara asleep against each other in the back of the wagon, and the cottonwoods were just beginning to show the first green of their new leaves, and the mountains were still white at the peaks but thawing lower down, and the river ran clear and fast with snowmelt. And she leaned her head on Emmett's shoulder, and he put his arm around her and drove one-handed, and it was ordinary and correct, and it was everything. Spring came to the Maddox ranch, which was, people in town began to say, the Maddox Kendrick Ranch, though the land stayed in Edna's name, because that was how she had built it, and Emmett had never suggested it should be otherwise with its usual demands and its usual gifts. The calving season was better than the year before, in part because Emmett had wintered the herd carefully and in part because luck goes back and forth, and this year it went better. There were 7 new calves, healthy and strong, and Thomas named all 7 of them with a system of names that appeared to correspond to some internal logic he declined to explain, but applied with perfect consistency. Clara's lizard was finally caught in April and named Harold, though Harold escaped 3 days later and resumed his life near the gatepost, which Clara accepted philosophically. In the summer, Thomas rode his first full cattle gather with Emmett, just the 2 of them and the Garza boys working the north section of the range, and he came home sunburned and saddle-sore and more pleased with himself than he'd been since before his father died, and he ate 2 plates of supper and told the story of the day in exhaustive detail, and fell asleep in his chair before the dishes were cleared. Edna caught Emmett's eye across the table, and he was watching Thomas sleep with an expression of such quiet pride that she had to look away again, because it moved through her chest like something warm and permanent. In August of that same year, she told Emmett she was pregnant. She told him on the porch in the evening, when the children were in bed, and the air was warm, and the stars over the territory were outrageous in their number and brightness, the way they are in the high desert when the moon is down. She said it simply, watching his face. His face did the same thing it always did when something large happened. It went very still for a moment, everything gathering inward, and then it opened. "A baby," he said. "By February, I think," she said. He put his hand on her face, his palm against her jaw, and he looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that she had looked into 1,000 times now and still found to be the most readable and the most honest face she knew. "Edna," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you," he said, which she understood to mean not merely for the information but for everything, for the ranch and the children and the morning in the November yard with the cloth, for all of it. She put her hand over his. "We are quite something," she said, "for 2 people who met over a sack of flour and a disputed fence line." He laughed, a full, genuine sound, the laugh she had heard build gradually over the past year and a half from something rare and surprised into something that came easy and often, and she loved it every single time. Thomas received the news with the practical orientation of someone who had already adjusted his worldview once and was capable of doing so again. "Where will it sleep?" he asked immediately. "We'll make room," Edna said. "I could move my bunk to the corner of the main room," Thomas said, with the tone of a man offering a viable logistical solution. "Let's think about it," Emmett said seriously, which was the correct response, and Thomas went to think about it himself. Clara's response was a sustained period of intense planning that involved drawings of room arrangements and a list of what she considered appropriate names, which leaned heavily toward names she'd encountered in the books Edna read them, and contained several that were not human names at all, but that Clara felt were underutilized. The winter of 1879 moved toward the spring of 1880, and the ranch moved with it, expanding and deepening in the way that a place does when the people on it have put their roots down without reservation. They extended the house, adding 2 rooms on the south side. Emmett and the Garza boys did the framing in October and the finishing work through November, and the new room smelled of pine and plaster and clean new wood, and when the first frost came the house was warm throughout, every corner of it. Edna spent the winter in the particular state of late pregnancy, which was ungainly and uncomfortable and occasionally wonderful. She continued to do everything she considered herself capable of doing: the accounts, the cooking, the planning, and the lighter work of the ranch. And she delegated, without excessive drama, the things she currently could not do. Emmett managed this balance with the same attentiveness he brought to everything, neither hovering nor leaving her to manage alone, always simply present where presence was needed and absent where it wasn't. On a clear, cold morning in the first week of February 1880, their son was born. Dr. Haverson came out before dawn when the labor began, and the children were sent to sleep at the Garza house, which Clara had accepted with negotiated conditions, and Thomas had accepted with stoic resignation. And the morning came up clear and cold over the river and the mountains, and their son came into the world with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and a strong voice about his feelings regarding the whole transition that was audible from several rooms away. Emmett held him first, because Haverson placed him there while he tended to Edna, and Emmett sat in the chair beside the bed with this small person in his large, careful hands, and he said nothing at all for a long moment. When Edna looked at him, she saw his face arranged in the same way it had been arranged on that November morning in the yard when she had cried and he had handed her a cloth, that absolute, unadorned presence, that openness. "Hello," he said to the baby. The baby blinked at him. It was impossible to say what was communicated in that exchange, but it was clearly something conclusive. They named him James Robert Kendrick Robert, for the man who had loved this land and these children before Emmett had, because that name deserved to continue forward, and James because it was Emmett's father's name, and he had never gotten to meet his grandchild, and this was what you did with names when people were gone and still mattered. Thomas and Clara came home from the Garza house that afternoon and stood at the foot of the bed in a row, Thomas straight and serious, and Clara with both hands clasped in front of her in a posture of attempted patience, and they looked at their brother. "He's very small," Thomas said. "They start that way," Edna said. "I was never that small," Clara said with enormous confidence. "You were smaller," Edna told her. Clara looked at the baby with new respect. Thomas reached out one finger and the baby's hand, which had been waving in the disorganized way of new babies, closed around it, and Thomas's expression shifted into something so open and unguarded that Edna committed it to memory on the spot. Emmett, standing in the doorway, watched his family and said nothing, and his face said everything. The spring of 1880 came to the Cimarron Valley in the way springs come in the territory, sudden and extravagant after the months of cold, the grass green along the river, and the cottonwoods throwing new leaves in the warm wind, and the mountains losing their snow to the higher elevations, while the lower ranges went soft and brown gold in the light. James slept and ate and expressed himself loudly and grew at the rate that well-loved children grow. And Thomas, who had gone very quiet and inward in the months after his father's death, had continued his return to himself all through the preceding year and a half, and was by now thoroughly and recognizably Thomas again, thoughtful and capable and occasionally funny in the dry, unexpected way that made everyone at the table stop what they were doing. There was a Sunday in May when the whole family rode out to the north pasture on horseback, Thomas on the bay, Clara on her pony that Emmett had found and brought home in February as an early birthday gift, James in the carrier Emmett had made from a canvas saddlebag adapted for the purpose, strapped to Emmett's chest, and they rode along the river in the morning light with the green cottonwoods overhead and the cattle moving in the distance and the mountains rising clear and white against the blue. And nobody said much, because there wasn't much that needed saying. Edna rode beside Emmett, and she looked at his profile against the morning sky, the long jaw with its silver scar, the gray eyes taking in the land with that particular calm attention, and she thought about the morning she had first seen him across the main street of Cimarron, A man with his hat in his hand having an argument with Arthur Beaumont on a bank's front steps, and she thought about how it had seemed then that she had no room for anything new. No space in the tight architecture of her survival for a single thing more, and how wrong she had been, not because there was more room than she'd thought, but because room could be made, and the making of it was not a compromise of what had been before but an addition to it, a thing built on the foundation of everything already there. Thomas rode up alongside her and said, "The grass in the east section is coming in good." "I know," she said. "I was thinking we should move the young steers up there in June." "That's what Emmett said too," Thomas said, with the tone of someone who has noted a pattern and approves of it. He rode forward again. Clara said, from somewhere behind them, "Harold is probably wondering where I am." "Harold is a lizard," Thomas said without looking back. "He does not wonder anything." "You don't know what Harold wonders," Clara said. Emmett caught Edna's eye, and she pressed her lips together, and he looked very determinedly at the horizon. James, oblivious to all of this, slept against Emmett's chest in his canvas carrier, with the complete confidence of someone who has never had reason to doubt that the world will hold him. The bank note was paid again in October of 1880, on time and in full, and when Edna came out of Beaumont's office with the receipt in her coat pocket, she stood on the main street of Cimarron for a moment in the October morning, and she did not feel triumphant exactly. She felt something steadier than triumph, something that had accumulated over the years of making the payments and running the ranch and building the life, something more like surety. Emmett was waiting for her at the wagon. He had brought Thomas and James into town. Clara was at school in Cimarron now, learning her letters with the fierce determination she brought to everything, and she was there this morning. And Thomas was at the general store getting the supply list filled, and James was in Emmett's arms, looking around at the main street of Cimarron with the bright, focused attention of a 10-month-old who finds everything equally astonishing. She came down the bank steps, and Emmett looked at her face and read it. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. She touched James's cheek with one finger, and he immediately tried to eat it. "2 more years on the note," she said. "2 more Octobers." "Then it's ours," he said. "It's already ours," she said. "The paper just takes a while to catch up." He smiled at her, the full smile that she had watched emerge over 2 years from something rare and careful into something she expected and relied on, and which still, without fail, did something to her chest. "Emmett," she said, "I was thinking about the spring planting. I'd like to expand the kitchen garden. There's room on the south side if we take out that section of scrub. And I think we should put in a proper root cellar this year, one that will keep through a real hard winter." "I was thinking the same thing," he said, "and I'd like to plant a fruit tree." He looked at her. "A fruit tree. An apple tree, I think. It takes years to produce, I know that. But Thomas will be grown and still on this land, and Clara will be grown and maybe near enough to visit, and James will be old enough to climb it by the time it bears. So," she looked at him, "I want to plant something for all that time ahead." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was truly hearing something. Then he said, "We'll plant it in the spring." "Southeast corner of the garden, where it gets the most light." She nodded. Thomas came out of the general store with both arms full of brown paper packages, and James reached toward him and made his urgent noises. And Thomas stopped and said, "Hello, James," in his serious way, and James subsided, satisfied. That evening, after supper and after the children were in bed, Thomas in his room, Clara in hers, James in the new cot in the room they'd added, Edna and Emmett sat on the porch together in the October dark, with the cold coming off the mountains and the stars bright over the valley. The Cimarron River moved in the dark below the east field, and the cottonwoods along its banks rustled with the wind, and the cattle were settled shapes in the darkness of the pasture. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the particular silence of people who do not need to fill silence. She thought about the morning at the graveside in March 1878, her knuckles white and her face still. She thought about the tin box with $37 under the floorboard. She thought about the night Clara's fever climbed, and the morning it broke and Emmett standing in the November yard with a folded cloth held out to her, and a voice that had said, "Take all the time you need, not as a courtesy, not as a thing you say, but as a true offer of time and steadiness from a person who had both to give." She had cried in front of him. She had let herself be seen in the moment when she was most unmade, when the months of holding everything together and holding everything back had arrived at the single fixed point of her daughter's survival and broken loose. And he had stood there and not looked away, and not made it small and not tried to make it stop. He had handed her a cloth and stayed. That was when she had known, not when he taught Clara to whistle, not when he looked at her in the kitchen over the corrected account book, not even on the morning in the yard when they had said what they felt. She had known it on the morning with the cloth, when a man had given her exactly what she needed by doing nothing more than being completely present. "What are you thinking about?" he said into the quiet. "November," she said. "A year ago." He pulled her a little closer. "What about it? You gave me your handkerchief." "I did. It was the right thing to do," she said. "Exactly the right thing. I've thought about it a lot." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd been carrying a great deal for a very long time," he said. "You needed somewhere to put it." "You were somewhere to put it," she said. "I hope I still am," he said. "Every day," she said. The October stars moved overhead in their slow ancient courses, and the river ran below the pasture, and the house held the sleeping children, and the apple tree would be planted in the spring and grow for all the years ahead of them. And Edna Maddox, who had buried her husband alone in the red dirt and held her children's hands and not cried, who had held a ranch together by the force of will and the willingness to wake up every morning and do the next thing, who had stood in a November yard and finally come undone in front of a man with gray eyes and a folded cloth and a voice like the steadiest thing she'd ever heard. Edna Maddox held her husband's hand in the October dark and breathed in and breathed out, and the land was theirs and the children were well, and the life they had built together was real and solid and good, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.